The second application of the starter tie also works as the finish tie. We use this at the top of the plywood. It does not have to line up with your spider tie stacks. In fact, most likely you're going to want to put these about the same spacing that you would do your anchor bolts. And they just simply slide on top of the plywood, just like this. If you want, you can go ahead and put a screw right there to hold it in place. Typically it's not necessary, but sometimes you might not want to have to worry about it. So if your anchor bolt placement is every 24 to 32 inches, then you would place these approximately spaced just like that. I'd like to show you a couple of the details about the starter tie. If you notice here, there's two pairs of holes. The first two holes are 1/2 inch in diameter. The second pair are 5/8. This first hole, when you place the finish tie like this on top of the wall, this hole is going to set your anchor bolt at its center of your pressure treated plate, center of 2x4. The second hole will put the bolt at the center of a 2x6, and the same applies with these 5/8 bolts if you're using for these 5/8 holes if you're using 5/8 bolts, center of 2x4, center of 2x6. Now, sometimes you need a brick ledge or a rock ledge. You would just do the reverse. Let's say you're using 1/2 inch anchor bolts. You'd put the holes to the inside, and this leaves you enough room. You do this first hole right here, after you put your pressure treated plate, to give you about a 4-inch brick ledge for your rock. Now, if you happen to live in an area where the anchor bolts need to be preset ahead of time, then you can simply take one of your anchor bolts, put a nut on all the way, slide it through the starter tie, thread another bolt tightly, then you'd set the starter tie right where you want, put either a hole at the top or through the side here, and that will hold your anchor bolt in place while you're pouring your concrete. Some building agencies require that to be the case, especially in a case for HD hold downs or if just all your anchor bolts need to be preset. I'm going to share some helpful tips how to finish off detailed areas. This is an outside corner, and there's a couple of ways that you can reinforce your outside corner. In this case, as we mentioned before, we let the plywood run along, and we put a 2x4 flat just like this, setting the screws every 6 to 8. In this case, it's just a 4-foot high wall, so we did every 12 inches on center. Longer screws than what you would normally use for the plywood. And then we put the same number of screws on the side here, and that ties the corner together. Other ways that you could do is put two 2x4s together in this fashion if both pieces of plywood finished off at the corner, and just wrap your outside corner. You'll see this, we did that style on the inside corners. On a short wall, the inside corners don't even need to be supported, but just in a case that we have if the concrete's a little too wet and we don't want anything to seep out of the forms, we go ahead and brace it. Now we're going to show you some other areas. Here's an example of an inside corner. We pre-screwed these two 2x4s together first, and then we went ahead and placed it inside the corner and putting screws every 6 to 8 inches. Screws that we used here about 2.5 to 3 inches long. There's no problem when they go through the plywood and stick into the concrete surface. They come out without any problem. As we mentioned, this is a good way also to wrap your outside corner if your two pieces of plywood come together right at the corner. This is an example of an end cap. This is what you'd use either at the end of a wall, or in this case, like we have a jump. This is the top of our concrete wall. The reason why this happens to be lower here is this is an entrance to a garage. Simply take a piece of your same form ply and rip it 8 inches wide, and then put a 2x4 backing on both sides. In this case, we use the same type of screws we're using with the forms. We screwed it into our 2x4. You slide it in place just like this. We let our plywood run long because we use our plywood over and over again, so we try to minimize the cutting. So whatever we have here, we work with and then put our block outs. So we've got a screw every 6 to 8 inches going down the side. A couple places on this foundation, we've got some doorways, so we made shorter ones like this. You drop them in the same way. Another way that you can end cap is if your plywood happens to come right to the end of the wall, then you can put a 2x4 on the outside, rip a piece of plywood a little bit wider, maybe about 12 inches, and put screws in 6 inches on center on both sides. By doing that, you'll have something plenty strong to support the concrete on the end of your walls. Well, our concrete truck is here. We're using a 50-50 mix or a grout mix, something with a small aggregate, because we're using a smaller line with a simple grout pump. If you're using a boom pump, you're going to still want to use the same mix, but you're going to want to use a smaller line, like a 2.5-inch line, with some type of reducer at the top. We're going to demonstrate some of the things you need to keep in mind when using a boom pump, because the forces of the concrete being dropped from such high levels will add excessive pressures on the bottom of your forms. So we're going to demonstrate that for you. And here's a solution to help reinforce the forms if you're using a boom pump. you want to take a continuous 2x4 and attach it to your forms about 6 to 8 inches up from the bottom on both sides. Then using one of these screws, these are like an oily log screw, they're 12 to 15 inches long. Go ahead and drive that screw all the way through from this side, clear through the forms, and have it grab onto the 2x4 on the other side. You only need to put these every 3 to 4 feet. Now you might be wondering, well, how do I get that out later? You have plenty of time. Once the concrete starts to set up and it's not completely dry, these screws back right out of the concrete without any problem. But what they do is they give the forms the necessary strength when you're using a boom pump, because as we mentioned, the amount of pressure from that concrete dropping down plus the weight of the concrete itself adds a tremendous amount of stress to the bottom of the forms.